A decorated detective faces the death penalty for a murder he swears he didn't commit. With execution drawing near, his loyal canine partner refuses to accept a new handler, somehow sensing what no human can. When the dog leads a skeptical former, who colleague to a forgotten crime scene, it unearths evidence that could change everything. Now, it's a desperate race against time to follow the trail of corruption leading straight to the department's highest ranks. With powerful enemies working to silence them permanently, will the truth come to light before the innocent man pays the ultimate price? And what devastating secret has remained hidden that only a dog's unwavering instinct could detect? Before we dive into this incredible story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy tales of loyalty and justice, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our newest videos. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Courtroom 305, casting harsh shadows across Detective Mike Reynolds' face. His hands remained perfectly still on the polished wood of the defendant's table, years of undercover work having taught him to control even the smallest tells. But inside, his heart hammered against his ribs as the jury filed back into the courtroom after 3 days of deliberation. Judge Eleanor Martinez's stern voice cut through the tense silence. Has the jury reached a verdict? The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged woman who wouldn't meet Mike's eyes. We have, Your Honor. Mike searched the courtroom one last time. His lawyer, Rachel Cohen, sat beside him, her shoulders already slightly slumped. Across the aisle, District Attorney Stephen Garrison's mouth twitched with the hint of a smile. In the gallery behind him, Police Captain Daniel Wilson sat stone-faced, flanked by officers from the department. Only one face showed any emotion. Jessica Taylor, his former partner, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep as she watched the proceedings with unwavering intensity. In the case of the state versus Michael Reynolds, on the count of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word crashed through Mike like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The jury recommends the death penalty. Mike's world narrowed to a pinpoint. 7 months ago, he'd been investigating a drug ring connected to crime boss Victor Ortiz. Then Detective Carl Morrison was found executed at the Overlook, and suddenly all evidence pointed to Mike. The gun with his fingerprints, the security, footage showing someone of his build at the scene, the witness claiming to have seen his car that night. It was a perfect frame-up, but he couldn't prove it. As bailiffs approached with handcuffs, Mike stood, his legs numb. Through the wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, he heard a familiar bark. Shadow, his Belgian Malinois canine partner, was being held by Officer Sullivan outside. The dog had been with him for 4 years, through countless drug busts and 2 bullet wounds. Now, like everything else in his life, Shadow would be reassigned. As Mike was led in cuffs past the gallery, Jessica stood. For 5 years they'd worked side by side before she transferred to cybercrime. I'll find the truth, she whispered fiercely as he passed. Mike couldn't bear to look back, but the sound of Shadow's increasingly frantic barking followed him down the courthouse corridor until the heavy metal door of the transport van slammed shut, cutting off the sound like a physical blow. That night, in his cell at Westridge State Penitentiary, Mike stared at the ceiling as reality settled over him like a suffocating weight. Death row. He'd put men here himself, always certain of their guilt. Now he understood the special hell of being innocent, with no way to prove it. Across town, Jessica unlocked her apartment door, Shadow trailing reluctantly behind her. It's just temporary, she told the dog, who paced restlessly between the door and window, whining occasionally as he checked each corner of the unfamiliar space. Jessica had volunteered to take Shadow when she heard he was rejecting every handler the department tried to assign. The dog had nearly bitten Officer Sullivan when he'd tried to take him to the K9 facility. "He'll settle eventually," the trainer had told her. But 3 weeks after the verdict, Shadow still spent every night pacing and watching the door. "He's not coming back, boy," Jessica whispered, but the dog just fixed her with his intelligent amber eyes, as if to say he knew something she didn't. The harsh buzz of the cell-block door made Mike flinch as he was escorted to the visitation room. 3 weeks had passed since the verdict, and this was his first approved visitor. Rachel Cohen looked exhausted as she sat across from him, a thick file folder on the table between them. "The appeal process has started," she said without preamble, "but I need to be honest with you, Mike. The evidence against you is substantial." "It was fabricated," Mike insisted, keeping his voice low. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to put me here." Rachel nodded. "I believe you, but believing and proving are different things. The gun was yours, from my home safe, which means someone had access. The witness was paid off or threatened. Maria Gonzalez never saw my car that night because I was across town at my sister's place. Emily's testimony wasn't enough. You arrived at 8:30, left at midnight. Morrison was killed between 9 and 11, which doesn't give you an alibi." Mike leaned forward. "Rachel, I was investigating corruption inside the department. Someone was helping Victor Ortiz move product. I was getting close." Rachel studied him carefully. "Who knew about your investigation?" "Just Captain Wilson and my former partner, Jessica Taylor." "You trust them both?" Mike hesitated. "I did." That night, Jessica dreamed of the day. They'd found Morrison's body at the Overlook. The detective sprawled beside his car, 2 bullet holes in his chest, execution style. In the dream, Shadow was there too, pulling at her sleeve, trying to lead her away from the body toward the wooded area beyond the parking lot. She woke with a start to find the dog standing by her bed, whining softly. "What is it, boy?" She mumbled, checking the time. 3:24 a.m. Shadow pawed at her comforter insistently, then trotted to the door, looking back expectantly. "You need to go out? Now?" The dog gave a soft bark of confirmation. With a sigh, Jessica pulled on sweatpants and a jacket over her pajamas and grabbed Shadow's leash. The moment they hit the sidewalk, Shadow pulled hard, nearly yanking her arm from its socket. "Shadow, heel!" she commanded, but the dog ignored her, dragging her toward her car with single-minded determination. "Fine," she muttered, unlocking the car. "Where are we going at 3 in the morning?" To her surprise, Shadow jumped in and sat alertly in the passenger seat, as if he knew exactly where they needed to go. Jessica started the car and pulled away from the curb. "You're the boss, apparently." She expected the dog to give some indication of direction, but he simply watched the road, perfectly calm, now that they were moving. Acting on instinct, Jessica headed toward the Overlook. It had been secured as a crime scene for weeks after Morrison's murder, but had since been reopened to the public. The moment she turned onto the winding road leading up to the scenic viewpoint, Shadow became agitated again, whining and shifting in his seat. When she parked in the now infamous spot where Morrison's body had been found, the dog bolted from the car the moment she opened the door. "Shadow!" she called, but he was already moving with purpose, nose to the ground, heading straight for the tree line beyond the parking area. Jessica followed, flashlight in hand, her police training taking over as she tracked the dog through the woods. After about 50 yards, Shadow stopped at a particular spot and began digging frantically at the base of a large oak tree. "What have you found?" Jessica knelt beside him, aiming her flashlight at the disturbed earth. As Shadow's powerful paws cleared away layers of dirt and decomposing leaves, something metallic glinted in the beam of light. Jessica's breath caught. Carefully, she pulled a pair of latex gloves from her jacket pocket, a habit from her detective, days she'd never broken, and gently extracted the object from the soil. It was a shell casing, tarnished but intact. Jessica's mind raced. According to the forensic report, both bullets that killed Morrison had been recovered from his body. The murder weapon, allegedly Mike's service pistol, had been found in a dumpster, 3 blocks from the scene. All shell casings had been accounted for at the scene, so why was there another casing buried in the woods, 50 yards from where Morrison was killed? Shadow sat watching her, his intelligent eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. "Good boy," Jessica whispered, carefully placing the casing in a small plastic bag from her pocket. "Very good boy." Back in her apartment, Jessica examined the shell casing under her desk lamp. Her heart raced as she recognized the caliber. 40 S&W, consistent with the department-issued Glocks. But something wasn't right. The firing pin impression looked different from standard department ammunition. Jessica had been in cybercrime for the past year, but she still had connections. She sent a text to Dr. Samantha Lee, a forensic specialist she trusted. "Need to meet. Unofficial. Important." The following day, they met at the Blue Line Diner, a spot far from the precinct where they wouldn't likely run into other officers. Dr. Lee examined the casing under a portable magnifier and frowned. "This isn't standard department issue," she confirmed. "The primer is different, and look at this ejector mark." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "It's from a different weapon than the one in evidence." "So there was a second shooter," Jessica breathed. "I'd need to run proper tests to confirm, but yes, that's what this suggests. Where did you find this?" "The overlook, about 50 yards, into the woods from where Morrison was found. That wasn't in any report I saw. It wasn't in the official search area. Shadow found it." Dr. Lee's eyebrows rose. "Reynolds' dog? Jessica, what exactly are you doing?" "Trying to make sure an innocent man doesn't die for something he didn't do. The evidence against him was overwhelming." "Too perfect," Jessica insisted. "Mike was investigating internal corruption before Morrison's murder. Then suddenly all this evidence appears gift-wrapped for the prosecution." Dr. Lee lowered her voice. "I didn't hear this from me, but there were inconsistencies in the Morrison case that got overruled. Lividity suggested the body was moved. The time of death window was narrowed without sufficient evidence. Someone was in a hurry to close the case." "Can you help me?" Dr. Lee hesitated. "Officially, no, but off the record. Tell me what you need." Jessica left the Blue Line Diner with renewed determination. She needed to get a deeper understanding of what Mike had been investigating before his arrest. She drove to Pine Creek Police Department, where she still had access despite her transfer to cybercrime. The department was quieter than usual for a Wednesday afternoon, with most officers out on patrol or in the field. Jessica kept her head down as she navigated the familiar hallways. Her destination was the evidence locker, where Mike's personal effects from his desk had been boxed up after his arrest. If there was anything that might help her understand his corruption investigation, it would be there. Officer Trent was on duty at the evidence desk, a young officer who joined after Jessica transferred to cybercrime. "Detective Taylor," he greeted her with a nod. "What can I help you with?" "I need to check something from the Reynolds case," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. "Some files that might be relevant to a cybercrime case I'm working on." Trent frowned. "That's a closed case, ma'am. Captain Wilson left strict instructions that those files are restricted." Jessica had anticipated this. "I have clearance," she said, pulling out her phone and showing a forged email that appeared to be from Wilson himself. Creating it had been easy with her cybercrime skills, though using it constituted a serious breach of protocol. "The captain's looking into possible digital connections to Ortiz. Since I worked with Reynolds, he thought I might recognize something. Trent studied the email, then nodded. Makes sense. Sign here, please. Jessica scrawled her signature on the log, hoping her racing pulse wasn't visible. Trent led her to a storage room where several boxes labeled Reynolds M sat on a shelf. "Take your time," he said. "Just let me know when you're finished." Once alone, Jessica quickly rifled through the boxes. Most contained case files, routine paperwork, and personal items from Mike's desk. In the third box, she found what she was looking for. A small notebook with a worn leather cover. Unlike his official case notes, which would have been entered into the department's system, this was Mike's personal notebook, where he often jotted his more unorthodox theories. Jessica slipped the notebook into her jacket and continued searching. At the bottom of the final box, taped beneath some files, she found a small flash drive labeled simply "Insurance." Her heart skipped a beat. This wasn't standard evidence. Cataloging, Mike had hidden this deliberately. As she pocketed the drive, the door to the evidence room opened. Jessica straightened up casually, expecting to see Officer Trent. Instead, Captain Daniel Wilson stood in the doorway, his imposing frame blocking her exit. "Detective Taylor," he said, his voice betraying no emotion. "I wasn't aware you had any ongoing business with the Reynolds case." Jessica kept her expression neutral. "Just following up on some digital patterns that might connect to a cybercrime." "Investigation, sir?" Wilson stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Interesting. I don't recall authorizing that." "The request went through proper channels," Jessica said, gesturing vaguely at her phone. "I can show you the approval." Wilson smiled thinly. "That won't be necessary. I sign those authorizations personally, Detective. I'd remember." He moved closer, his eyes hard. "What are you really looking for?" Jessica felt her back press against the shelving unit. "Just doing my job, Captain. Your job is in cybercrime now, not homicide, not the Morrison case." Wilson's gaze swept over the open boxes. Reynolds was dirty. The evidence was conclusive. Why risk your career digging through a closed case? If the evidence was so conclusive, why restrict access to his files? Jessica countered, trying to maneuver toward the door. Wilson blocked her path. "Because Reynolds had friends in the department, like you, and some people have trouble accepting the truth about their friends." The tension in the small room was palpable. Jessica knew she was in dangerous territory. If Wilson suspected she had found anything, she might not walk out of this room. The door swung open again, and Officer Trent appeared. "Everything okay in here, Captain?" The interruption broke the tension. Wilson stepped back, his professional mask slipping back into place. "Fine, Trent. Detective Taylor was just finishing up." Jessica nodded, grateful for the interruption. "All done. Thank you for your assistance." As she walked out, she felt Wilson's eyes burning into her back. She had what she needed, but she'd also confirmed something else. Wilson was watching her every move. She would need to be extremely careful moving forward. Back in her car, Jessica took a moment to steady her breathing. Shadow, who had been waiting patiently, sensed her distress and nudged her hand with his nose. She scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "We need somewhere safe to look at these," she murmured to the dog. Jessica drove to Pine Creek Public Library, a sprawling building with private study rooms and, crucially, no surveillance cameras inside. After securing a room in the back, she laid out Mike's notebook and plugged the flash drive into her laptop. The notebook contained exactly what she'd hoped for: detailed notes on Mike's internal corruption investigation, names, dates, suspicious financial transactions. Most entries referenced Captain Wilson and Officer Sullivan, documenting meetings with known associates of Victor Ortiz. One name appeared repeatedly in the margins: Carl Morrison. According to Mike's notes, Morrison had approached him privately 6 weeks before his murder, sharing concerns about Wilson. They'd agreed to conduct parallel investigations, keeping each other informed but not officially collaborating to minimize risk. The flash drive contained even more damning evidence: photographs of Wilson meeting with Ortiz at remote locations, audio recordings of conversations discussing drug shipments and payoffs, and most critically, bank statements showing regular deposits to offshore accounts in Wilson's name. Jessica's hands trembled as she viewed a final audio file dated 3 days before Morrison's murder. It was a recording of a phone call between Wilson and an unidentified person. "Reynolds is getting too close. Morrison too. We need to handle this permanently." "Both of them? That's messy. One takes the fall for the other. Cleaner that way. I'll make the arrangements." The call ended there, but the implications were clear. Wilson had orchestrated Morrison's murder and framed Mike for it, eliminating both threats to his operation in one move. Jessica copied everything to her secure cloud storage, then carefully repacked the notebook and flash drive. She couldn't risk returning these to the evidence room now that Wilson was suspicious, but she couldn't keep them with her either. She needed somewhere safe, somewhere Wilson wouldn't think to look. As she pondered her options, her phone rang. The caller. ID showed Emily Reynolds, Mike's sister. "Jessica, I just got a strange call from someone at the department asking about you," Emily said, her voice tight with worry. "They wanted to know if you'd contacted me recently or if you'd been to Mike's apartment." "What did you tell them?" "That I haven't heard from you in weeks. Was that right?" "Perfect. Listen, Emily, I need a favor. I have something important that needs to be kept safe. Mike's things are still at his apartment. I haven't touched anything since they arrested him." "That's too obvious. They might search there." Jessica thought for a moment. "What about your mother's place at the lake? Does anyone else know about it?" "Just family. Mike and I used to spend summers there as kids." "Is it still in your family?" "Yes. Mom left it to us when she passed. It's been sitting empty for years." "Good. I need you to meet me there tonight. Don't tell anyone, and make sure you're not followed." Jessica disconnected and immediately removed the battery from her phone. If Wilson was already making inquiries, she couldn't risk being tracked through her cell signal. She would need a burner phone soon, but for now, complete disconnection was safer. She glanced at Shadow, who watched her with unwavering attention. "We're in this now, boy. No turning back." The lake house was an hour outside Pine Creek, nestled among pine trees, with a small private dock extending into the still water. Jessica arrived after dark, parking her car behind the house, where it wouldn't be visible from the road. Shadow immediately leapt out, exploring the unfamiliar territory with his nose to the ground. Emily arrived 20 minutes later, her face drawn with worry. Inside the dusty cabin, Jessica laid out everything she'd discovered while Shadow kept watch by the window. "This is..." Emily struggled to find words as she examined the evidence. "This proves Mike was set up." "It's enough to force a new investigation," Jessica agreed, "but we need to be careful how we use it. Wilson has connections throughout the department, possibly in the DA's office too. What about internal affairs? I don't know who to trust there either. Wilson's been with the department for 20 years. He has friends everywhere." Emily rubbed her temples. "So what's the plan? Mike's appeal was denied. They've scheduled the..." She couldn't bring herself to say the word execution. "I need to find someone above Wilson's influence. Someone who can't be intimidated or bought." Jessica paced the small living room. "And I need to understand exactly how they framed Mike. The evidence against him was too perfect." She turned to Emily. "I need to see the crime scene again, properly this time. Not just where Morrison was found, but the surrounding area too. The police already searched everything. They searched where they wanted to find evidence, Jessica corrected, not necessarily where the evidence actually was. She glanced at Shadow, who had alerted to something outside. His ears perked. Forward. Shadow found that shell casing where no one thought to look. What else might be out there? Emily agreed to keep the notebook and flash drive hidden at the lake house. Jessica would take photographs of the key evidence with her so she could continue investigating without risking the originals. She also accepted the keys to a beaten-up pickup truck that had belonged to Emily's ex-husband. It's registered in his name, and he moved to California years ago, Emily explained. No one will connect it to you or Mike. With fresh determination, Jessica and Shadow set out at dawn the next morning. Their first stop was the Overlook, but this time, Jessica came prepared with proper evidence collection tools borrowed from Dr. Lee. Evidence bags, tweezers, luminol, and a high-powered light source for detecting traces invisible to the naked eye. The Overlook was deserted at this early hour, the parking area empty except for a few fallen leaves dancing in the morning breeze. Yellow crime scene tape still clung to a nearby tree, forgotten after the investigation concluded. Jessica parked the borrowed truck and let Shadow out. "Show me where you found the casing again," she urged. Shadow immediately headed for the tree line, stopping at the oak tree where they'd made their discovery. Jessica marked the spot, then began a methodical search of the surrounding area, moving in an expanding spiral pattern away from the tree. Shadow worked alongside her, his nose more sensitive than any equipment she carried. 30 yards further, into the woods, he alerted again, pouring excitedly at a patch of ground covered with pine needles. Jessica carefully cleared away the debris, revealing disturbed soil. Using a small garden trowel, she excavated carefully. 6 inches down, her trowel clinked against something solid. It was a small metal box, the kind used for storing ammunition. Jessica photographed it in situ before carefully removing it from the ground. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a Glock 22, the same model carried by Pine Creek PD officers, but not Mike's service weapon, which had supposedly been the murder weapon. Another gun, Jessica breathed. She examined it carefully without touching it directly. The serial number had been filed off, but there was something familiar about a small scratch on the barrel. She took multiple photos from different angles, then carefully rewrapped the weapon and placed it in an evidence bag. Shadow wasn't finished. He continued deeper into the woods, moving with purpose until he reached a small clearing. Here, the ground showed subtle signs of disturbance. Broken twigs, compressed soil, a scuff mark on a tree trunk at shoulder height. To an untrained eye, it would look like normal forest activity. To Jessica, it told a different story. This is where it actually happened, she realized aloud. Morrison was killed here, then moved to the parking lot. She began processing the scene methodically, using luminol to reveal faint blood stains on fallen leaves and the base of a tree. Blood that had soaked into the ground and vegetation, impossible to completely clean up. She collected soil samples, bark from the tree with the scuff mark, and photographed everything. As the sun climbed higher, Jessica became aware of how exposed they were. If anyone from the department discovered what she was doing, her investigation would be over, and she might be in serious danger. "Time to go, Shadow," she called softly. The dog trotted over, his mission at the Overlook apparently complete. Back in the truck, Jessica checked her watch. It was still early enough that most officers would be changing shifts or having breakfast, the perfect time for her next move. The Pine Creek Herald's offices were housed in a red brick building downtown. Jessica had worked with Tim Russo, the crime reporter, on several cases in the past. If anyone would understand the importance of what she'd found and have the means to protect the information, it would be Tim. She found him at his desk, nursing a large coffee and scanning through police reports. His eyebrows shot up when he saw her walk in with Shadow. "Detective Taylor," he greeted her cautiously. "To what do I owe the pleasure? And since when do you have a K9 partner?" "I'm just Jessica today, Tim, and Shadow here is a temporary arrangement." She closed his office door. "I need your help with something sensitive, something that could be dangerous for both of us." Tim's expression sobered. "This about Reynolds?" Jessica nodded. "Everyone thinks he's guilty. Everyone's wrong." Tim leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You have proof?" "I'm getting there. I need someone who can hold information securely. Someone outside the department. If something happens to me, I need to know this evidence won't disappear." Tim's journalistic instincts were clearly piqued. "What kind of evidence?" Jessica took out her phone and showed him the photographs of what she'd found. The shell, casing, the buried gun, the second crime scene, the bloodstains revealed by luminol. Then she played the audio recording of Wilson discussing the need to handle Mike and Morrison. Tim's face grew increasingly grim as he reviewed each piece. Jessica, this is big. If what you're suggesting is true, it means Captain Wilson orchestrated a murder and framed an innocent officer. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. Why bring this to me? Why not Internal Affairs or the state police? Because I don't know how far Wilson's influence reaches. The evidence against Mike was fabricated, but officially processed. That means Wilson has allies throughout the system. Tim nodded slowly. "So you need someone outside the system." "I need a watchdog, Tim. Someone who can make this public if necessary. You realize what you're asking. If I publish any of this without absolute confirmation, my career is over. If I sit on evidence of police corruption and an innocent man is executed, I couldn't live with myself. I'm not asking you to publish yet, just to be the insurance policy. Keep copies of everything I've found. If something happens to me, you'll know what to do with it." Tim studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay. But I want everything you have, and I want to be kept in the loop as you find more. And Jessica, be careful. People who frame cops for murder don't play by the rules." Jessica transferred copies of all her evidence to Tim's encrypted server, explaining each piece as she did so. Shadow lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to survey the office before settling back down. "There's something else," Jessica said as she finished the file transfer. "I need to know who within the department might be clean. Someone high enough to have authority, but not in Wilson's pocket." Tim thought for a moment. "Lieutenant Diana Chen in Internal Affairs. She transferred in from State Police 6 months ago. No connections to anyone in Pine Creek PD. Reputation for being incorruptible." Jessica made a mental note of the name. "One more thing. I need a secure place to stay for a few days. Somewhere no one would think to look for me." Tim reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a key. "My brother's hunting cabin, about 40 miles north of here. No electricity, but it has a wood stove and running water. He won't be there until deer season." Jessica took the key gratefully. "I'll only need it for a few days, just until I can figure out my next move." As she stood to leave, Tim asked the question she'd been dreading. "The execution date is set for 2 weeks from now. Do you have enough time?" Jessica looked down at Shadow, who stared back at her with unwavering trust. "We don't have a choice. We have to make the time count." Outside the Herald building, Jessica checked for any signs of surveillance before heading to the truck. She needed to regroup, plan her next steps carefully. The evidence she'd collected painted a damning picture, but there were still gaps that needed filling. How had they obtained Mike's service weapon for the frame-up? Who had actually pulled the trigger on Morrison? And most importantly, how could she get this evidence in front of someone with the authority and integrity to act on it? Shadow suddenly tensed beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Jessica followed his gaze across the street, where Officer Kevin Sullivan was watching them from a parked patrol car. Their eyes met briefly before Sullivan started his engine and pulled away from the curb. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't tell if the encounter was coincidental or if Sullivan had been specifically tracking her movements. Either way, her window of operation was shrinking. Wilson would be watching her closely now, possibly monitoring her communications and movements. She needed to accelerate her investigation before they moved to stop her permanently. Jessica drove the borrowed truck in a random pattern through town, making sure she wasn't being followed, before heading to a cheap motel on the outskirts of Pine Creek. She paid cash for a room at the back, away from the road, and settled in with Shadow to review everything she knew. The pieces were starting to fit together, but time was running out. She needed to make her move soon. The execution date was approaching, and Wilson would be growing increasingly desperate to shut down her investigation. As night fell, Jessica sat cross-legged on the motel bed, maps and notes spread around her, formulating a plan that would either save Mike's life or put her own in grave danger. Shadow lay beside her, his warm presence a reminder of exactly what they were fighting for and what they stood to lose if they failed. As night settled over Pine Creek, Jessica stared at the motel ceiling, piecing together everything she had learned. Shadow dozed beside her, his ears occasionally twitching at sounds from the parking lot outside. The evidence against Mike had been meticulously fabricated, but why frame him specifically? There had to be something she was missing. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Shadow was instantly alert, a low growl building in his throat. Jessica drew her weapon and approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. Frank Harris, a retired detective who had been Mike's first partner 20 years ago, stood outside. Jessica had reached out to him earlier, but hadn't expected him to find her so quickly. "How did you know where I was?" she asked after letting him in. "Small town," Frank replied, his weathered face grim. "And I still have friends at the department. Word is Wilson's put out an unofficial APB on you and the dog, not through proper channels, just to officers loyal to him." "So I'm running out of time," Jessica concluded. Frank nodded, eyeing the evidence spread across the bed. "What have you found?" Jessica showed him everything: the shell casing, photos of the buried gun, the blood evidence from the second crime scene in the woods, and Mike's corruption investigation notes. "Morrison and Mike were both investigating Wilson," she explained. "Separately at first, then they started comparing notes. 3 days before Morrison was killed, Wilson was recorded discussing the need to handle both of them." Frank studied the evidence with the careful attention of a veteran detective. "This is solid work, Jess. But there's something you should know about Morrison." "What?" "He came to see me a week before he died, said he'd found evidence of massive drug seizure thefts, millions in narcotics that never made it to evidence lockup. He suspected Wilson was replacing real drugs with fake ones before processing, then selling the originals through Ortiz's distribution network." "That explains the money," Jessica realized. Mike's notes mentioned suspicious offshore accounts. "Morrison also said something else," Frank continued. "He believed Wilson had a protector, someone higher up protecting the operation. He never told me who." This new information changed everything. If Wilson wasn't the top of the corruption chain, then simply bringing him down might not be enough to exonerate Mike. They needed to identify his protector. "We need to follow the money," Jessica decided. "I might be able to help with that," Frank said. "After I retired, I did some consulting work for financial crimes, still have contacts at the Treasury Department." While Frank made calls to his Treasury contact, Jessica reviewed Morrison's financial investigation notes from Mike's flash drive. The detective had traced suspicious transfers from offshore accounts back to Pine Creek through a series of shell companies. All the companies had been established by the same law firm, Garrison, Phelps and Associates. The name Garrison struck a chord. Stephen Garrison, the district attorney who had prosecuted Mike with unusual personal involvement. "Frank," Jessica interrupted his call. "The DA Garrison. His name is connected to the shell companies Wilson was using." Frank's eyes widened. "The district attorney. That would explain how they got the frame-up through the system so cleanly. Evidence processing, witness statements, rushed warrant approvals. Garrison could facilitate all of it. This complicated matters significantly. Going to the authorities with their evidence would be even riskier if the district attorney was involved. They needed irrefutable proof linking Garrison directly to Wilson's operation. "There's one place we haven't looked," Jessica said, an idea forming. "The Harbor Point storage facility. Mike mentioned it in his notes, a unit Wilson visited regularly, but wasn't registered in his name. Could be where they're keeping records of the real operation," Frank suggested. "Or drugs waiting for distribution," Jessica added. "Either way, it's worth checking." Shadow's ears suddenly perked up. He moved to the window, growling softly. Jessica carefully pulled back the curtain to see a patrol car slowly cruising through the motel parking lot. "We need to move," she whispered. "Now." They gathered the evidence and slipped out the back window. Frank's old truck was parked behind the motel, offering them an escape route away from the searching patrol car. Shadow jumped in first, followed by Jessica and Frank. "Harbor Point is on the other side of town," Frank said, as he navigated back roads to avoid main streets where they might be spotted. "If Wilson's looking for us, he might have men watching it." "We don't have a choice," Jessica replied. "If Garrison is involved, our window of opportunity is closing fast." As they approached the storage facility, Jessica noticed two unmarked cars parked near the entrance. "Police surveillance," she noted. "They're expecting us." Frank drove past without slowing and turned into an alley 2 blocks away. "There's another way in. The facility backs up to the old railway yard. Fence has had a hole in it for years." They left the truck hidden behind a defunct warehouse and proceeded on foot. Shadow led the way, his training making him naturally stealthy as they navigated through the abandoned rail yard. When they reached the fence, the hole Frank had mentioned was still there, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. The storage facility was dimly lit, security cameras positioned at main intersections but leaving blind spots between rows. Jessica consulted Mike's notes for the unit number, 219. "This way," she whispered, keeping to the shadows with Shadow close beside her. Unit 219 was in the back corner of the facility, away from the main access road. A heavy padlock secured the roll-up door. Jessica examined it closely. "Can you pick it?" Frank asked. "Not this type," Jessica replied, but she knelt beside Shadow. "Find it, boy, find Mike's scent." The Belgian Malinois understood immediately. He circled the unit, nose working furiously, before stopping at a spot near the corner of the building. Jessica followed and discovered a small access panel, likely for maintenance, fastened with a simpler lock that she could pick. "Good boy," she whispered, working on the lock with tools from her pocket. The panel opened with a soft creak, revealing a tight space barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Jessica went first, then helped Shadow climb in. Frank, despite his age, managed to follow with minimal difficulty. Inside, the storage unit was meticulously organized. Metal shelving units held labeled boxes. A desk in the corner supported a computer and file cabinet. But what caught Jessica's attention immediately were the stacks of brick-shaped packages on the far wall, drugs wrapped and ready for distribution. "This is it," she breathed. "The missing drug seizures." Frank examined the packages. "Street, a value of several million at least. Must be what they skimmed from the last few major busts." Jessica moved to the desk and booted up the computer, while Frank searched through the files. Shadow remained alert near the entrance, sensing the importance of their discovery. The computer was password protected, but Jessica's cybercrime experience proved useful. She bypassed the security and found exactly what they needed: spreadsheets detailing the entire operation, dates of seizures, amounts skimmed, distribution schedules, and most importantly, payment records showing transfers to accounts belonging to both Wilson and Garrison. "This is everything," Jessica said, copying the files to her phone. "Complete records of their operation, connecting Wilson and Garrison directly." As she worked, Shadow suddenly tensed, a low growl building in his throat. Frank moved quickly to the maintenance panel and peered out. "Cars pulling in," he reported. "Wilson and Sullivan." Jessica's heart raced. "Is there another way out?" Frank shook his head. "That panel is it." They were trapped. The unit had no windows, and the main door would make too much noise to open. Jessica looked around desperately for options. "We need to hide," Frank decided. "Let them enter, then try to slip out when they're distracted." It was a dangerous plan, but they had no alternative. Frank quickly helped Jessica conceal their evidence in her backpack. They positioned themselves behind stacks of boxes. Shadow, pressing close to Jessica's side, somehow understanding the need for absolute silence. Outside, voices approached. Jessica recognized Wilson's commanding tone, giving instructions to Sullivan. Keys jangled, and the main door began to roll up with a metallic rattle. Wilson and Sullivan entered, along with a third man, whose voice Jessica recognized with a chill. "District Attorney Stephen Garrison. We need to move everything tonight," Garrison was saying. "The state police are getting too interested in the Morrison case. Someone's been feeding them information." "Taylor," Wilson growled. "She's been digging into Reynolds' old files, visiting the crime scene." "Then find her," Garrison snapped. "This operation is too valuable to jeopardize. Once Reynolds is executed next week, the case will be officially closed. We just need to maintain control until then." Sullivan moved toward the desk, uncomfortably close to where Jessica and Frank were hiding. "What about the new shipment? Ortiz's men are expecting delivery tomorrow." "It proceeds as planned," Wilson replied. "But after that, we go dark for a while. Let things cool down." Jessica's phone suddenly vibrated in her pocket, a text message arriving at the worst possible moment. She silenced it instantly, but Sullivan had heard something. He turned, scanning the storage unit suspiciously. "What is it?" Wilson asked. "Thought I heard something," Sullivan replied, moving toward the boxes concealing Jessica and Frank. Shadow made the decision for them. With lightning speed, he burst from hiding and launched himself at Sullivan, knocking the officer off his feet. The distraction gave Jessica and Frank the moment they needed to emerge, weapons drawn. "Don't move," Jessica commanded, covering Wilson and Garrison while Frank secured Sullivan, who was still struggling against Shadow's powerful hold. Wilson's hand moved toward his weapon, but Jessica's warning shot into the concrete floor stopped him. "Next, one won't miss, Captain." "Detective Taylor," Garrison said smoothly, raising his hands. "Whatever you think you've discovered, I assure you there's an explanation." "Save it for your arraignment," Jessica replied. "We have everything: the drug skimming operation, the offshore accounts, Morrison's murder, and Mike's frame-up. It's over." Wilson's eyes darted between Jessica and the exit, calculating his chances. Frank saw it coming and shifted his position to block any escape attempt. "Don't try it, Daniel," Frank warned, his retired detective voice carrying the beam weight of decades of authority. "You're finished." The tension in the room was broken by the sound of sirens approaching outside. Jessica's phone buzzed again, a message from Lieutenant Chen. "In position. Signal when ready." Jessica almost laughed with relief. The text that had nearly exposed them had been Chen confirming the state police were in position, responding to the evidence Jessica had sent earlier as insurance. "Hear those sirens, Garrison?" Jessica asked. "That's the state police, not Pine Creek PD, not your corrupt judges, not anyone you can control. And they have copies of everything we found here." The fight visibly drained from Wilson's posture. Garrison maintained his composed facade, but the slight tremor in his raised hands betrayed his understanding that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing. Outside, tactical teams breached the facility. Lieutenant Chen led the officers who secured the storage unit, professionally taking Wilson, Garrison, and Sullivan into custody, while evidence technicians began documenting the drugs and computer files. "Perfect timing," Jessica told Chen as the prisoners were led away. "We've been building this case since Morrison's death," Chen revealed. "Sullivan was working undercover for us, gathering evidence against Wilson and Garrison. When you started investigating, we had to let you proceed carefully. We couldn't risk exposing Sullivan's cover." Jessica looked at Sullivan, who was now speaking with state police officers, his arrest clearly staged. "He let us find the evidence at the Overlook." Chen nodded. "He couldn't guide you directly, but he made sure the areas weren't disturbed during the official investigation. We needed independent discovery of the evidence to strengthen the case against Garrison, who had too many connections for us to move against directly." "What about Mike?" Frank asked, the question that mattered most. "Judge Winters has already signed the order staying the execution," Chen assured them. "With this evidence, Reynolds should be released within days." Shadow pressed against Jessica's leg, his mission seemingly complete. She knelt beside him, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The best boy." 3 days later, Jessica waited outside Westridge State Penitentiary, Shadow sitting alertly beside her. The heavy gates opened with a mechanical groan, and Mike Reynolds walked out, squinting against sunlight he hadn't properly seen in months. Shadow broke free from Jessica's light hold, racing toward his handler with unbounded joy. Mike knelt to receive him, nearly bowled over by the dog's enthusiastic greeting. "I missed you too, boy," Mike laughed, burying his face in Shadow's fur. To hide the emotion overwhelming him, Jessica approached more slowly, giving them their moment. When Mike finally stood, Shadow remained pressed against his leg as if afraid to let him out of sight again. "Thank you," Mike said simply, the words inadequate for what she had done. Jessica shook her head. "Thank him. He never stopped believing in you. Led us straight to the evidence everyone else missed." "Partners for life," Mike said, scratching. Behind Shadow's ears, the dog looked up at him with complete devotion, his mission fulfilled. The full extent of Wilson and Garrison's corruption shocked Pine Creek. 6 officers were eventually indicted, along with Victor Ortiz and several city officials who had helped conceal the operation. Millions in stolen drugs and laundered money were recovered. Mike received a formal apology from the police commissioner and a substantial settlement for his wrongful conviction. But his faith in the system had been irreparably damaged. He declined offers to return to the force. Instead, 3 months later, Reynolds-Taylor investigations opened in a converted boathouse overlooking Pine Creek Harbor. Specializing in wrongful conviction cases, they quickly gained a reputation for taking on the cases others deemed hopeless. Shadow had his own space in the office, a comfortable bed positioned where he could keep watch over both partners as they worked. Their first case came from Lieutenant Chen, another potentially innocent person facing conviction based on suspiciously perfect evidence. As they reviewed the file together, Shadow lay contentedly between them, occasionally looking up as if offering his own insights. "You know," Mike said, breaking a comfortable silence, "in all the legal proceedings and media coverage, no one's really acknowledged the most important fact in my case." "What's that?" Jessica asked. Mike reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, the dog leaning into his touch with complete trust. That sometimes justice has 4 legs and a wet nose. Jessica smiled, watching the bond between man and dog that had ultimately rewritten history. In a system where evidence could be fabricated and truth manipulated to serve the powerful, it had been the pure, unwavering instinct of a dog that had made all the difference. Outside the office window, the sun began to set over Pine Creek Harbor, painting the water in brilliant oranges and golds. Shadow moved to the window, watching the view with serene contentment. His handler was free, justice had been served, and his family was together again. For a dog who had helped overturn a death sentence and expose a criminal conspiracy, it was enough to simply have his pack reunited, the greatest reward for an extraordinary act of loyalty. 6 months after Mike's exoneration, Reynolds Taylor. Investigations had become well established in Pine Creek. Their converted boathouse office overlooking the harbor was a far cry from the sterile precinct where they'd once worked, but it suited them perfectly. Large windows offered views of fishing boats and sailboats bobbing in the harbor, while inside, the space had been transformed into a professional but comfortable workspace. Shadow had adjusted well to his new role. No longer an official K-9 officer, he was nevertheless an integral part of their team, with an uncanny ability to sense when something was amiss. His bed, positioned between Mike and Jessica's desks, gave him a perfect vantage point to observe their work while keeping watch over his humans. On this particular morning, Mike was reviewing case notes while Jessica fielded calls from potential clients. Their reputation for taking on hopeless cases, particularly wrongful convictions, had spread beyond Pine Creek, bringing inquiries from across the state. "Another referral from Lieutenant Chen," Jessica announced, hanging up the phone. "Man convicted of armed robbery based on eyewitness testimony and security footage. His wife claims the footage was doctored." Mike looked up from his files. "Seems to be Chen's specialty, finding us cases involving questionable evidence." "She knows we'll dig deeper than most," Jessica replied. "After what happened with your case, she doesn't trust evidence at face value anymore." Shadow's ears perked up at a sound outside before either human noticed anything. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Frank Harris entered, carrying a file folder and looking more serious than usual. "Morning, Frank," Mike greeted the retired detective who had become a regular consultant for their agency. "You look like you're carrying bad news." Frank placed the folder on Mike's desk. "Not bad exactly, just complicated. Remember James Parker?" Mike frowned. "The sergeant from narcotics who testified against me? Said he saw me arguing with Morrison the day he was killed?" "That's him. He was found dead this morning, apparent suicide." Jessica moved to look at the file Frank had brought. "Apparent? He left a note confessing to perjury in your case. Said Wilson pressured him to testify falsely about seeing you with Morrison. According to the responding officers, he shot himself afterward." Mike leafed through the preliminary report. "Convenient timing. Wilson and Garrison's trial starts next week." "Too convenient," Frank agreed. "Parker was supposed to testify for the prosecution. His statement about being coerced into false testimony would have strengthened the case against Wilson." "You didn't think it wasn't suicide?" Jessica asked. Frank shrugged. "The scene looked clean, too clean maybe. But I'm just an old retired cop with suspicions. Nothing concrete." Mike and Jessica exchanged glances. They'd learned the hard way how corruption could reach into every corner of the justice system. "Parker lived alone," Frank continued. "Divorced last year, no children. His ex-wife found him when she came to drop off some belongings. She's the one who called it in." Shadow had wandered over during the conversation, pressing his nose against the crime scene photos with unusual interest. "Something's got his attention," Jessica observed. Mike studied the dog's behavior. Shadow had proven his investigative instincts repeatedly, beginning with finding the shell casing that ultimately broke Mike's case. His interest in these photos couldn't be dismissed. "I think we need to look into this," Mike decided. "If someone is eliminating witnesses before the trial, then Wilson and Garrison might have allies we haven't identified yet," Jessica finished. Within an hour, they were at Parker's house, a modest bungalow in a quiet neighborhood. Lieutenant Chen had arranged access to the scene after forensics had finished their initial work. The body had been removed, but otherwise, the scene remained untouched. Bloodstains on the armchair where Parker had allegedly shot himself, the recovered weapon bagged and tagged on the evidence table. Shadow entered first, nose working diligently, as he systematically circled the living room where Parker had died. Mike and Jessica observed his movements carefully, having learned to trust the dog's instincts. "The note was found on the desk," Chen explained, pointing to a sealed evidence bag containing a handwritten confession. "Initial analysis suggests it matches Parker's handwriting, though more detailed examination is pending." "Time of death?" Jessica asked, watching as Shadow moved into the kitchen, still tracking something invisible to human senses. "Between 9 p.m. and midnight last night. Ex-wife found him at 7 this morning." Shadow had stopped near the back door, growling softly. There was nothing visibly unusual about the area, but the dog's behavior was unmistakable. "What is it, boy?" Mike asked. Approaching carefully, Shadow pawed at the floor near the threshold, then looked up at Mike expectantly. Jessica joined them, examining the area with her flashlight. The hardwood flooring appeared unmarked, but when she ran her finger along a seam between boards, she detected something gritty. "There's sand here," she noted. "Just a trace, but definitely sand." Chen frowned. "Parker's house is miles from the beach." Mike knelt beside Shadow, who was still focused on the same spot. "Good boy," he praised, taking an evidence bag from Chen to collect samples of the sand. They continued examining the house, with Shadow leading them to several spots that seemed insignificant to human observers. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom, a particular book on the living room shelf, and the inside of Parker's washing machine, which contained recently washed clothes. "He's finding something we can't see," Jessica said, as they watched Shadow sniff intently at the washing machine's drum. "Or smell," Mike added. "Remember how he tracked Morrison's scent at the Overlook months after his death?" Chen bagged the washed clothes for analysis. "I'll rush these to the lab, see if they can detect any residue. The sand sample, too." As they prepared to leave, Shadow made one final discovery, pawing insistently at a loose baseboard in Parker's bedroom. When Mike removed it, they found a burner phone hidden in the wall cavity. "Parker was afraid of something," Jessica observed as Chen bagged the phone. "Enough to hide a secret phone and wash clothes right before supposedly killing himself." "Not standard pre-suicide behavior," Frank agreed. Back at their office, they assembled the pieces of this new puzzle. The lab had called with preliminary results. The sand contained mineral compositions typical of Harbor Point Beach, not the public beaches on the other side of Pine Creek. The clothes from the washing machine had faint traces of gunpowder residue, despite being washed. Most tellingly, the burner phone contained text messages arranging a meeting at Harbor Point the night Parker died. "The messages are from someone identified only as M," Jessica noted, reviewing the phone records Chen had forwarded. "The last one confirms a meeting at 10 p.m. at Harbor Point Storage, not far from where we found Wilson and Garrison's operation." "Harbor Point again," Mike mused. "That whole area seems connected to this conspiracy." Shadow, who had been dozing on his bed, suddenly lifted his head, ears forward. A moment later, they heard footsteps on the dock outside. Emily Reynolds, Mike's sister, appeared at the door, her expression worried. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I just heard something you should know. I was having coffee at the Blue Line when two officers came in. They were discussing Parker's suicide and mentioned that his ex-wife has disappeared. She never returned to the station to complete her statement." This new information changed the complexity of the case entirely. If Parker's ex-wife had disappeared after finding his body, it suggested she might have witnessed something or someone that put her in danger. "What was her name?" Jessica asked, already pulling up records on her computer. "Vanessa Parker," Emily supplied. "She works at Harbor Point Medical Center as a nurse." Mike was already grabbing his jacket. "We need to find her before whoever silenced Parker does." They split up to cover more ground. Frank would check Vanessa's apartment with Chen, while Mike and Jessica took Shadow to Harbor Point Medical Center. The dog had proven his ability to track people, and if Vanessa had been at the hospital recently, he might pick up her scent. At the medical center, they showed Vanessa's photo to the staff. A colleague confirmed she had called in sick that morning after finding her ex-husband's body, but no one had heard from her since. "She has a locker in the staff room," the colleague offered. "Maybe there's something there that could help." With hospital security's permission, they accessed the locker. Inside was nothing unusual: spare scrubs, toiletries, a novel. But when Shadow sniffed the contents, he became agitated, pawing at a small appointment book tucked into a side pocket. Jessica flipped through it, finding a notation for the previous evening. JP, 8:30, storage. JP, James Parker, Mike realized. She met with him last night before he died. As they were leaving the hospital, Jessica's phone rang. It was Frank. "Vanessa's apartment shows signs of a hasty departure," he reported. "Drawers left open, clothes missing, but no signs of struggle or forced entry. Looks like she fled voluntarily." "We think she met with Parker last night at what might be the Harbor Point storage facility," Jessica informed him. "We're heading there now." "Be careful," Frank warned. "If she witnessed Parker's murder, whoever did it might be watching for her to return." With Shadow leading the way, they approached Harbor Point storage cautiously. The facility had been a crime scene during Wilson and Garrison's arrest, but operations had since resumed under new management. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the rows of storage units, creating numerous hiding spots for potential observers. Which unit would they have used? Jessica wondered aloud as they scanned the facility. Shadow provided the answer, moving purposefully toward a unit near the back, number 342. Unlike the others, its padlock hung open, the hasp damaged as if forced. Mike drew his weapon, and Jessica followed suit, with Shadow positioned beside them. Mike carefully pushed the door upward. The unit was mostly empty, except for some abandoned furniture and boxes. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Then Shadow moved directly to a tarp-covered shape in the back corner. When Mike pulled away the tarp, they discovered a small sailboat on a trailer. Perfect place to hide something, or someone, Mike noted, examining the vessel. The cabin was empty, but Shadow continued to show interest in the boat. Jessica checked the small storage compartments built into the hull. In one, she found a waterproof bag containing a woman's wallet, identification, and a USB drive. "Vanessa's ID," she confirmed. "But where is she?" Shadow suddenly lifted his head. Ears perked toward the marina visible through the open storage. "Unit door." He gave a short bark, his alert signal, and moved urgently toward the exit. "He's onto something," Mike said, following the dog. Shadow led them at a brisk pace toward the docks, where dozens of boats were moored. Without hesitation, he headed for a small cabin cruiser named Second Chance at the end of the pier. As they approached, they saw movement inside the cabin. Mike approached cautiously. "Vanessa Parker, Pine Creek Investigations. We're here to help." The cabin door opened slowly, revealing a woman matching Vanessa's photo. her face pale with fear and exhaustion. "How did you find me?" "Your ex-husband's case led us here," Jessica explained as they boarded, "and Shadow has a talent for finding people." Inside the cabin, Vanessa explained everything. She had indeed met James the night before, not at the storage unit as planned, but at his house. He had discovered evidence that Wilson and Garrison's operation extended beyond what had been uncovered, involving judges, state officials, and even federal agents. James was gathering evidence to expand the case, Vanessa explained. He felt guilty about testifying against Reynolds and wanted to make amends by exposing the entire network. "But someone got to him first," Mike concluded. Vanessa nodded. "We were reviewing his evidence when someone broke in through the back door. James told me to hide in the bedroom closet. I heard them arguing, then a gunshot. When everything went quiet, I peeked out and saw two men staging the scene to look like suicide. They forced James's hand around the gun to leave residue, planted the note, and cleaned up any signs of their presence." "Did you recognize the men?" Jessica asked. "One was a police officer, Sullivan, I think his name was. The other I'd never seen before, but James seemed to know him, called him Marshall." Mike and Jessica exchanged shocked glances. Kevin Sullivan was supposed to be one of the good guys, the undercover officer working with internal affairs who had helped bring down Wilson and Garrison. "After they left, I grabbed the evidence James had collected and ran," Vanessa continued. "I knew they'd come looking for me next if they realized I was there." "The USB drive?" Jessica asked. "Everything," James gathered. "Bank records, meeting dates, names of everyone involved." Sullivan was playing both sides, pretending to help the investigation while actually protecting the bigger players. This revelation changed everything about their understanding of the case. Sullivan hadn't been helping them find evidence to save Mike. He had been controlling what they found, ensuring that only Wilson and Garrison took the fall while the larger conspiracy remained hidden. "We need to get this to Lieutenant Chen immediately," Mike said, examining the USB drive. "Not Chen," Vanessa objected urgently. "James wasn't sure who in the department could be trusted. That's why he was building his own case independently. They needed someone completely outside the local power structure." Jessica suggested contacting the FBI field office in the state capital directly, bypassing any potentially compromised local authorities. As they helped Vanessa gather her belongings, Shadow suddenly tensed, growling toward the dock. Through the cabin window, they spotted Sullivan and another man approaching the boat, weapons drawn. "Back exit," Mike whispered, guiding them toward the rear of the cabin, where a small platform offered access to the water. There was no time for subtlety. Mike fired a warning shot over Sullivan's head, while Jessica helped Vanessa over the side into a small, inflatable dinghy tied to the back of the cruiser. Shadow jumped in without hesitation, somehow understanding the urgency of their escape. "Go!" Mike shouted, providing covering fire as Jessica started the dinghy's motor. Sullivan and his companion returned fire, bullets splintering the wooden deck around them. Mike made a running leap into the dinghy as Jessica accelerated away from the dock, zigzagging to make them harder targets. "Call Chen!" Mike shouted over the engine noise. "Let her know Sullivan's been compromised." Jessica made the call while navigating the small craft toward the opposite shore. Sullivan and his companion had reached another boat and were in pursuit. But the smaller dinghy had a head start and could access shallower waters. They reached a secluded cove where the pursuing boat couldn't follow, beaching the dinghy and continuing on foot through coastal woods. Shadow led the way, naturally taking point as they moved through unfamiliar terrain. Frank met them at a predetermined emergency rendezvous point, an old fishing cabin he owned outside Pine Creek. From there, they contacted the FBI directly, using Frank's old connections to arrange a secure meeting. 2 days later, the full extent of the conspiracy was revealed. Sullivan and several other officers were arrested. The mysterious Marshall was identified as U.S. Marshal Richard Keller, who had been providing protection and new identities to corrupt officials in exchange for a percentage of their criminal proceeds. The operation extended far beyond Pine Creek, involving judicial corruption and organized crime across 3 states. The evidence Vanessa rescued proved critical in expanding the case. Parker's suicide was officially reclassified as homicide, and Vanessa entered witness protection after providing testimony that helped secure indictments against more than 30 officials, including judges who had helped ensure Mike's conviction. A month after Sullivan's arrest, Mike, Jessica, and Shadow stood on the deck of their office, watching the sunset over Pine Creek Harbor. The case that had nearly cost Mike his life had evolved into something far larger than they had initially imagined, exposing corruption at every level of the justice system. "Hard to believe it's finally over," Jessica said, leaning on the railing beside Mike. "Is it?" Mike wondered aloud. "We exposed the conspiracy in Pine Creek, but how many other places have similar operations running? How many other innocent people are sitting in cells, or worse, on death row, because of corrupt cops and prosecutors?" Shadow pressed against Mike's leg, offering the silent comfort that had sustained him through his darkest moments. Mike scratched behind the dog's ears, drawing strength from the partner who had literally saved his life. "That's why we're doing this," Jessica said, gesturing to their office. "One case at a time, one life at a time. We can't fix the entire system, but we can fight the battles in front of us." Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears forward, tail wagging slightly as he gazed down the dock. Lieutenant Chen was approaching, carrying a file folder. "New case?" Mike asked as she joined them on the deck. Chen nodded. "Another seemingly perfect conviction, evidence that doesn't quite add up. Judge who rushed the proceedings." She handed over the file. "Thought you might be interested." Mike accepted the folder, feeling the weight of the responsibility it represented. Another life hanging in the balance, another chance to set right what the system had gotten wrong. "We're interested," he confirmed, feeling Shadow's steady presence beside him. As Chen left, they reviewed the new case together. The pattern was familiar, overwhelming evidence appearing suddenly, witnesses with suspicious connections, procedural irregularities overlooked by the defense. "Looks like we've got work to do," Jessica said, already mapping out their investigation strategy. Mike nodded, watching as Shadow settled comfortably between their chairs, alert and ready. The dog who had led them to justice once would help them find it again. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the harbor. One case concluded, another beginning. The path forward would never be easy, but they faced it together, 2 detectives and the remarkable dog who had rewritten history, not through legal arguments or courtroom procedures, but through the simplest and most powerful force of all, unwavering loyalty. As darkness fell over Pine Creek, Shadow gazed up at his humans with complete trust. To him, the complexity of human justice systems meant nothing. He understood only that his pack was complete, his handler was safe, and tomorrow would bring new scents to track, new puzzles to solve. For a dog who had saved an innocent man from execution, that certainty was enough. The rest was just details. If you were moved by this story of unwavering loyalty and the pursuit of truth, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who appreciates the special bond between humans and their animal companions. Comment below with your own stories of how a pet's intuition amazed you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.